You mentioned the Krinky debacle. Could you explain that debacle to me?
Yeah, the Ukrainians established a very small beachhead on the Dnieper River, the Russian occupied side, not far from Kherson City. So it was within the Kherson region. Now it's a very small beachhead, and it was a small village surrounded by swamp, basically, right there on the banks of the Dnieper. Um, but they did it. They got a few guys over there, and they constantly reinforced them. The Russians just kept on bombing them and bombing them and bombing them, and they kept on sending more people over, get killed, and then they would send more reinforcements in little boats, and the Russians would strike the boats as they went across. But inevitably, some boats would make it through, and they would thereby reinforce that very small beachhead, and it lasted for several months, maybe close to a year. But they never got anywhere. They were just there on the banks, these muddy banks of the Dnieper. And the Russians were all around them. The Russians were always hitting them. The losses were horrific. And I remember reading very hellish accounts. These Ukrainian soldiers were saying that survived it, said like this was the worst of the worst. This was the most awful experience. You get there and you end up in a muddy hole and you just wait to die. That's it. And then you die and they send somebody else to die in your place. And this went on for the longest time. It was actually, we learned later, a plan hatched by the British. This was something that they pushed the Ukrainians to do. And the idea was that you cross the Dnieper, you establish a beachhead, and then you can march on towards the Sea of Azov and Crimea. And it just never even got close to that. The thing is, it's so ridiculous, is they think about in the Zaporozhye offensive in the summer of 2023, they never even breached one line of those defensive lines of fortifications that the Russians had built up in the previous months. They never even got through the first line. Now you're telling me that this tiny little beachhead, on this muddy bank, that was going to go. They were going to go marching up the hills, and then beyond them there were actually these lines of fortifications. So it was never made any sense. But the British pushed it hard, and to the great detriment of the Ukrainians. They suffered horrific losses.
Maybe that's one of the reasons why the Brits are just so unable to come to terms with what's happening and talk to Russia and admit that they lost, because they were behind Krinky debacle. They were behind Kursk, from what I understand, was they were involved.
Yeah, right.
Right, and they keep on giving these platitudes, as long as it takes, and they just have this hubris that we were the great empire and we're great strategists, when in fact they seem to be idiots when it comes to strategy. Well,
yeah.
It makes me wonder when this is all said and done, because like we use the term proxy war, but I think I might have been Alexander McCurr saying that proxy war is not even correct at this point. The amount of involvement from NATO and the West is beyond a typical proxy, that we are a co-belligerent. And at some point, we said that Ukraine has to talk to Russia. It probably won't be Zelensky. Russia will keep on moving forward until there is somebody in power in Ukraine that will talk to Russia and say, we got to end this, for real, instead of just whatever Keir Starmer and Zelensky want to do. Mm-hmm. When that happens, when they start to talk, do you think that they will come to the conclusion that, hey, this isn't your fault, Ukraine. This is NATO's fault. This is America's fault. This is the British's fault. And then, because there's a lot of ample evidence for that, it's very true that a lot of it is the fault of the US and NATO.
They pushed us not to sign the Istanbul Agreement, for example. They
Minsk
promised
1,
us,
Minsk
right.
Right, all of them. Minsk 1, Minsk 2, Istanbul, as long as it takes. We got your back. We promise you NATO membership. Do the Kursk invasion, do the Krinky Bridge one. Don't worry, we'll send you all of our equipment. We'll plan the summer offensive, and you'll just blast on through.
Yeah.
If you were kept on being fed that stuff, maybe I could see myself in that position. Like, yeah, we can do it. America says we got it. The Brits keep on telling us how awesome we are, and they got our backs. And then now look what's happening.
And how weak the Russians are.
Right.
Exactly.
How weak those shovels. It's those damn shovels. They keep on, breaking through our defense. So when that happens, do you think that's a likely outcome when there is a dialogue, that it's like, Look,
It's a possibility. I mean, the thing is, you see it. You can think of in past wars. You can have the people very patriotically supportive of their government until the very end, and then when their government, their army is finally utterly defeated, you can see um, expressions of extreme anger and disillusionment. I mean, I think you could say that in Germany, at the end of the Second World War, but even in the South at the end of the Civil War, it's just like, so we lost all these people. And we believed in, we thought, you kept on promising us victory. So there was a lot of anger. I mean, it's mixed and it's complicated, but there is that, undoubtedly, that kind of anger and disillusionment will be unleashed to some extent. I think there's no question about it. But I think also I just want to add, because you were asking about Europe, again, it's just the supporters of the Ukraine. This is the problem. If you support, a country in a war, and it turns out to be a losing war, you put yourself in a very difficult, moral and emotional position. Because, on your advice, this country has sacrificed hundreds and thousands of, their young men. Many of their cities have been destroyed, and it's not very easy to say, "Oops, my bad." You don't say that, right? So it's just like, but that actually would be the right thing to do. It's like, I got this wrong, but it's such a horrible mistake that you're admitting to that you just can't admit it to them or to yourself, and so you double down. Because it becomes, and it's like almost the less tenable your position becomes. The farther divorced from reality, the more that you double down, because the greater the enormity of your mistake, it's that grows too. And so you just refuse to see it, and you just go all the way down to the very end, the path of utter destruction.
right, right, and I do think that this could be a logical conclusion to this war, because Russia has also maintained the moral high ground. They have shown the constant willingness to reach a settlement, to negotiate, to avoid vindictive behavior, to be vengeful. There's a lot of pressure on Putin, but the fact
Right.
that Putin has gone slow and methodical and tried his best to avoid civilian casualties, I think will make it easier for once this is finally collapsed and there's a government in power that begins talking to Ukraine, the true narrative comes out, and then they need somebody to blame. Well, it's very easy, because the actual people to blame for a big part of this war is the West, and then they'll start to point fingers at the West, and yeah, you'll just show just how horrific this whole policy that we had was about turning Ukraine into a battering ram into Russia. Just how stupid of a strategy this was, and
Yeah.
how evil it was, and the whole thing will just fall apart.
Right. Yeah. No, I think there's a chance for that. But we may have to go all the way to the end before it really happens. I guess that's the sad truth, because there are those
I'm always
countervailing forces.
surprised. I always feel like this war is going to come to an end soon, because it just sounds like Ukraine doesn't have much left, but they just keep going. It
Yeah.
doesn't seem like you're saying another 2 years maybe till this is all wrapped up. I don't
Right.
know.
I just, because like you, I've been surprised by how, how tenacious they have been. They've been brutal. I mean, look, how they're conscripting their own citizens in a way that, I have really never seen before. I don't think any of us have. Um, but it's effective. They get bodies. Yeah, these, again, like, it's clear these people, a lot of these people that they're sending, I think the great majority don't want to be there. But if you put somebody in a trench and you give him a gun, he'll just fight for his own life. And so he does become, a force of resistance that way. He may hate you, may hate your government, but, maybe, what would I do if I was in a trench there? I might and I see the soldiers coming across the field at me. I'd be scared to death and start shooting at them, right?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know either.
You don't know. Nobody knows until you're in that situation.
Right.
That's one of
don't
those things.
But you can see how
It's-
that happens.
Right, I can see how it happens, but it's just, it's just such a horror story.
Well, the thing is, I don't know. I've said this 2 years, but I have no idea. I don't think anybody does. I've heard that Russian intelligence recently revised their estimate of the length of the war. That they did have something like 2 years or even beyond. Just a few months ago, that was their forecast, but that they revised it down significantly, and because they do believe that there is a collapse is imminent. And we'll see. The thing is, like, again, you can have, this is true of so many different, let's say, processes, whether we're talking about something physical, like, again, like eating away at the foundations of a building, or a war. You can have, things can appear to move very slowly, but you're eating away at the foundations. And then at some point, a collapse occurs and things happen very quickly. So it could be, we're just used to this slow movement. Yes, it has gotten faster. It was really accelerating like through the fall into November. Then, like we said, it fell off, but then it's starting to accelerate again, and from a higher level than where it was a year ago. But it's still Ukraine's a large country. At the current rate, we're talking about 50 years or something. But that can be very deceiving because, again, this is a war of attrition, and the focus is not on taking territory; it's on destroying, the enemy's ability to fight. And at some point, you achieve that, and then there's the rapid territorial gains. It could, we could see a very quick transformation, but who knows when? Maybe this year, maybe next year.